Every stage of mastery has its strengths. So implicit mastery does free you up while you're doing things to not have to pay so much attention to some elements. The way to make sure you never reach a plateau is that you are always in some way stretching yourself when you're working. If you're stretching yourself in how you do it, you'll eventually have to start thinking about, how do I bring a new quality to my way of doing it?
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, good to be back here with you.
Hey, Sharif, it's great to be back again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to continue our series here. We have our now third episode on mastery. The first one being the overview 2 episodes ago, and then we had the 3 stages of mastery: the explicit phase, the implicit phase, and the optimizing stage. And so now in the third episode, we can dive into that implicit phase, right?
Mm-hmm. Sounds great.
Yeah, Kevin, maybe at least for me, I kind of associate the implicit phase with, we talked about like procedural memory, and when you do something, practice something so often that it becomes just deeply ingrained. And I think of kind of muscle memory, like playing the piano, that you get a piece just kind of gets in your hands, or athletic type things when you improve your technique and your form so much that just the right technique becomes automatic. So am I in the ballpark there with those 2 examples?
Yeah, I think those can be signs of the implicit stage, but I would say that the hallmark of the implicit stage is that you no longer have to consciously think about the next step. So it means that procedural memory is guiding you. You don't have to deliberately think about what to do. Now, sometimes just the logic of a task is such that it's so clear what you do next. I was, the last few days, I've been working on getting one of my websites into a French version of it. And that means going through a lot of things, and someone helped me to produce the French translation. And so I was going through that and cutting and pasting, checking things with ChatGPT to make sure the French was good. Well, I didn't have to think about the next steps because it was just pretty clear that this was a good way of doing it. I'd play around a little bit. So I think what's clear though is that in that whole task, as long as I'd work on it, it was just one thing after another, because there's 50 little text boxes I would have to change. But it just means that the next steps are clear enough that the prediction is confident. Basically your brain is able to confidently predict what you want to do next. That kind of confidence then allows you to, in fact, have a certain, that you can get the spirit of the task, and you can improvise with that spirit, as you learn to do it better and better. So anyway, I think those are some of the hallmarks I would see of the implicit stage.
So it seems like, I think in the first episode, 2 episodes ago, we talked about the fact that the height of mastery is not automaticity, or the heights of habits, which I think is how a lot of people maybe talk about it nowadays, is that you want to develop a habit to the point where it becomes automatic. And then when it's automatic, it's easy. And then when it's easy, you do it more. Like flossing or something. It's really important for our lives that flossing is just something that you do automatically, right before going to bed or something. Mm-hmm. But it seems like when something becomes too easy, it becomes boring. And this text box. Okay, now this text box. And you have 75 text boxes to do in an hour or something. Then so how do you balance this? Okay, I want it to become automatic and second nature, and it shouldn't be so easy that now it's boring and I just don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah, so I think there could be higher levels of ways of challenging yourself that we would get to in the optimizing stage. Like, what is a higher form of mastery you can attain than merely being efficient? So at this implicit stage, though, we're not yet trying, in a sense, what we're trying to do is really make sure we have the spirit of the task. We don't have to consciously think about what comes next. So there is this way in which the implicit stage inherently tends toward automaticity. And that's, in a sense, why it's a danger, right? I think it's the most dangerous of the stages. Because the early explicit stage, well, that's you deliberately thinking, how could I do this in a kind of better way, and laying out steps. But then as you get practiced at doing them, what should happen in the implicit stage is that you just get more creative and flexible and more confident that you can. And so that would be all really healthy growth. But to go beyond this, then you need to start thinking in deeper ways about, okay, what really would be a better way of doing this? So you could get stuck at the implicit stage. And in my mind, automaticity can be one of the signs that you're stuck. That the only focus is on doing things as efficiently as possible. And that kind of drains them of meaning. And that's, I think, why it's boring. That just doing it more and more efficiently. Now, any series of steps that you normally do will tend towards automation. I think where most people experience this, if they have a commute, is their drive. The commute itself, it can happen. It's called highway hypnosis, where you don't even remember any of the steps in between. You just know you got on the highway, and at one point you got off, and you can't remember anything. And that is a sign of automaticity, that there is nothing. So probably you're daydreaming. Your default mode was active in some way, but you weren't consciously thinking about what you're doing. So is that the best way to get through your commute? I don't think so. Because then, would you really want to get through more and more of your life in that kind of phase, in that kind of mode? Probably not.
Mm-hmm. So there's this danger then in once you get pretty good at something, just staying there. Like, okay, I'm confident that I can, basically do this every time this way, and that's kind of good enough for me right now. So, what do we do to then shake ourselves out of that? It seems like the way we talk about, okay, you need a new strategy. A strategy is goals and steps. So it seems like at one level you could, maybe stretch for a higher goal that then would require you to make new steps. Is that kind of what we're
Yeah, I think as a rule, in the implicit stage, people tend to focus mostly on quantity goals rather than quality goals. And the qualities that would be best would be creativity and flexibility, to try to bring that spirit to how they do things, just to make sure that they're not getting stuck on the plateau. But I think the danger here that we're talking about is a plateau, where I can think of my own, say, playing piano, that once I started med school, my repertoire stopped expanding. But I could still play things pretty decently for a long time. But the number of things I could play like that started to go down and down. So now I can only play well if I don't think about it at all and everything happens automatically. But if I try to deliberately think about what I'm playing, it all falls apart. So I would say that in one sense, I've been on a plateau because my repertoire hasn't expanded. But another, it really is a degradation. That the plateau, you're either moving forward or moving backward. And plateaus, actually, in some senses, are even an illusion. What's really happening is you are moving backwards in some way. And at least you're no longer challenging yourself to do this task in a new and better way, not with greater creativity and flexibility and getting into the spirit of it and even to do it as efficiently as possible. And so it gets kind of drained gradually of meaning. And that draining is a sign that, in fact, there's a degradation taking place. So we either move forward or we move back. We would like to see in all areas of our life, there's a little bit of kind of honing of mastery that's taking place. That we're always trying to put our best into things, put care into little things and the little details and how we finish things well.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say on the point of creativity, because I mentioned that one way you could break through the plateau is by setting a new goal and changing this and making new steps. But then I remember I think you made this point earlier that medicine is a lot about the steps, following the steps. And I know there's this book, the Checklist Manifesto about surgery. And I think if I were going into surgery, I wouldn't feel that great if the surgeon I knew was experimenting with a new strategy. I think I would just want him or her to just do what works and has worked in the past. So how would you, if then now you're suggesting, well, they don't need to change the steps. They can just change the qualities with which they perform them, put more care and attention into the details and so forth. Is that is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think that in any kind of field, you can look and see the people who are at the very top, who are the very best at what they do, what's different about how they are doing X. So if I were a surgeon, I would be trying to get the videos of the best surgeons, to be watching those videos, which I'm sure they're available in different ways, to see how exactly does this surgeon handle this kind of situation when it arises. So you can read, for me as a clinician, I love reading books written by master clinicians. It just, their expertise, their experience kind of shows in every single paragraph. I think, wow, these people know exactly how to handle this. That's very different, in my experience, from reading books written by researchers, where they have lots of studies they cite, but I just get the feeling that they don't even know exactly what are the important questions to ask. So you can always find ways of kind of honing your skills by looking, and this is part of the explicit stage, to think of people who are better. So I think one way of not getting stuck on a plateau is you, in fact, go back to the explicit stage, think about how you're doing what you're doing, and think, now, are there any new steps I could improvise and make those more implicit with practice? So that would be one way of thinking about it, to kind of deliberately go back a step, new explicit steps laid out, and then you work on practicing those.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support.
Well, Kevin, I'd love to tie in these implicit mastery and mastery more generally with other elements of our approach. And in particular, we talk about attaining flow at will. And I remember this was one of the first ideas that stuck out to me about OptimalWork, is following the steps of reframing, mindfulness challenge, launches you into flow at will, and you can learn with practice to attain at will. So maybe the first thing just to take here is flow, because it seems like flow is going to be very similar to what we're talking about here. When you have an implicit strategy, you don't even have to think about the next step. So it seems kind of like effortless attention, effortless focus, which is precisely what flow is. So can you explain a little bit the relationship between this implicit strategy and flow?
Anytime you have some level of mastery and are challenging yourself in a task, you can go into flow. So the mastery element covers everything in a way. I think that even at the explicit stage, if you lay out the steps of what you're about to do, now your default attention can prepare in advance the next step. And then as you finish step 1 with your task attention, you get magnetically drawn to step 2. And then your default attention prepares step 3 while you work on step 2. And then when that's done, you get magnetically drawn to step 3. So flow really is the seamless cooperation of your two forms of attention. Task attention and default attention working together, and you get pulled gently through the task. Now, that would be possible as long as you have removed the guesswork for your default attention, so it knows how to pull you to the correct next step. But I would emphasize even the explicit stage is able to do that. And so that's why in my experience working with, with students and professionals is if they could lay out the steps in advance before they do something, they are way more likely to experience flow while they do it. And it's the almost universal experience. And in a way that includes for many of them a challenge, that just sticking to those steps intentionally is like, it gives them a kind of stretch. So the laid out steps, that's explicit mastery. And then the challenge is sticking to them. And if they make that intention for a certain period of time, then they can experience flow in that time. But I would just say it's much easier to go into flow when you've trained your default attention, which sits atop this whole structure called procedural memory, to know what to do next, so that you intellectually, in a sense, know what comes next. You know what your default attention can know what the right prediction is, but even your muscle memory kind of takes you, along with that. That's a lower thing in us, but it can pull you to what comes next. So flow is much more easy to go into when you're at the implicit stage of mastery.
Well, I think that's a great point to bring up. Hyperfocus, which is kind of like the doppelganger of flow. So as many of the same qualities, you might lose track of time, feel totally immersed in what you're doing. But at the same time, we talk about it as more your attention is captured by the thing, the object, the task. So for instance, playing video games is often an example of hyperfocus as opposed to flow. So what exactly is there a difference here in terms of the strategies that people are using, the implicit strategies, the procedural memory, automaticity? Like, how does that show up here different in hyperfocus than in flow?
Yeah, so hyperfocus in some way requires some kind of implicit mastery. So if you were perfectly new at programming, you wouldn't get into hyperfocus probably while programming. But with repetition, now you're able to go into hyperfocus because you've laid down how to go through this step by step. So if you are just focused on getting something done as efficiently as possible, then the logic of the task itself can kind of pull you through. And it's like your attention has now been captured by that task. But and so I think that's what we call hyperfocus. And so the difference between that and flow is when you're in flow, there is a meta awareness you have of how you're working and why you're working that isn't really available to you when you're in hyperfocus. So people in hyperfocus, their attention is dominated by the step they're on and the task itself, but not on how they're doing it and why they're doing it, how they could shape it. Flow is marked by this greater sense of awareness of yourself as you do the task, but in a way that doesn't distract you, that allows you to, you could be, for instance, aware that you're hearing some unrelated sound without being distracted by that sound. So I think of flow as being the fully deliberate deployment, of this kind of momentum within a task. So you can be carried through, but it's deliberate. But hyperfocus is not deliberate.
Kevin, you mentioned earlier that you can attain flow by crafting explicit steps. So even in that explicit phase, you can attain flow. So my question is, what happens when you get the steps wrong? Like, what do you do? So I guess at one level, you get to maybe say a wrong step, and you realize, oh, this is not right. I'm stuck here. So okay, you want to take a step back, but it also seems like you can get the wrong step. You train yourself so that the wrong step becomes automatic at some point. And this comes up to me in sports when people have like bad technique that they've trained that's become implicit, or probably in piano too. It's the same thing that you just have bad finger technique, and that's just how you do it now. And so you have these ingrained bad habits. So how does that happen? Because it seems like bad steps should actually prevent you from attaining the outcomes so that you wouldn't actually practice them. But they do somehow get deeply ingrained. So how does that work?
Well, I think this is another problem with the implicit stage is it can set you up for automated bad habits. Any problem that people have any problem, in some way can be seen as a negative form of mastery. So whatever problems are consistently in your life, in some way you have mastered the production of that problem. So that's a funny way of thinking about it and looking at it. But there are things that people do that are in some ways how they do the problem. And so when you think of, say, the issue of, now I want to make it really clear that this is not meant in any way to kind of be blaming people for it. It's instead important that because people see that they could in fact lay out the steps of what normally happens in a problem situation. I see this in my practice, and like, there's a few cases where I see it again and again. One is in anxiety, another is with addictions, and another is with arguments in couples. And so take the last one. When a couple has an argument, they have a certain way of doing arguments. There's the first trigger. And it might be that someone perceives the other has slighted them in some way. And then there's a kind of shot across the bow. There's something kind of that's defensive. And then there's something more emotionally escalated. They start using words like always and never, and then they raise the tone of voice. You could lay out exactly the steps that, between you and another person, how you typically do the argument. So one way of just thinking about that is a form of dismastery. It's like a negative mastery that people have developed, that they've gotten really good at arguing together. So then you can think more flexibly, like, what if we changed these steps? What would happen? Because their mastery of these steps is so strong, using mastery here in a negative sense, where it's purely automated, not optimized. So in that kind of sense, they've gotten really good at doing this, but there are like ways you can start to play with it when you see it this way. And one way of playing with it is to ask, how does the problem normally end? And so maybe the couple, if I'm, say talking to them, would say something like, then one of them will text the other, and by text, they'll say something. Or maybe they talk on the phone with each other, but maybe these problems tend not to resolve face to face, but later they're talking on the phone and then they realize everything is okay. And they both apologize and they move on. Well, then the idea is, this comes from an approach called solutions-oriented therapy or solutions-oriented brief therapy. What if you just move that solution earlier in the sequence? So that instead of getting to, say, the always and never stage of the argument where those things start being said, you agree to take some time and then you'll text each other in an hour. Or you'll make a phone call in an hour. Sometimes even inserting a very bizarre step that's not normally one of them. And I can't remember if this was Milton Erickson or one of his disciples, had a couple that would get in these fierce arguments. And then he said, well, now the next time, if you're going to have an argument, one rule is the husband has to disrobe and then go into the shower. And then you can resume the argument, right? Which is bizarre enough, but they did it actually. And when they came back a few weeks later, in fact, they had the best weeks ever. And they a few times started getting into an argument, and then he had to go to the bathroom, take his clothes off, get in the shower, and then say, okay, I'm ready. And then she would come in and they would try to argue. And it just didn't work. So the idea about seeing the problems as a kind of dismastery, a negative mastery, means that just changing the sequence of steps can be a surprisingly powerful way of breaking the bad habit. And I mean, the same thing happens again with addictions and anxiety. But there are these normal patterns. There's a trigger, and then there's a normal sequence of things. But then it always will come to an end in some way. And you try to see, okay, if we see this as a strategy, how does this give us a way to play with it and change it?
Mm-hmm. So, Kevin, how would you apply that to like work? So if, I'm just trying to, so like, approaching the task in a new way, inserting some kind of new step. Maybe an example would be like a student writing a paper and their current approach isn't working very well, or they have the same kind of approach that always leads to them, staying up super late the night before it's due and doing it. So how would they?
Yeah, or you could say like, what about the problem might be, say, writer's block.
Okay.
And the way they do the problem is they take one look at the prompt, they open up a blank word processing document, and they stare at the screen. And then they let time go, and they start every 5 minutes, they check the clock, and they wait till their frustration gets to a certain level. They go do something else for a while, then they come back. And so you can go through and lay out what are the steps of the problem of writer's block. And then ask, okay, when writer's block comes to an end, how does it normally end? Well, maybe they force themselves to just make an outline, or they just start typing, doing kind of the free writing exercise. I always talk about the most dangerous writing app, which is a great way of getting over writer's block. And you set it to hardcore mode. So you just start typing, and if you stop for 4 or 5 seconds, you lose everything. And you set a time, like it'll go for like 3, 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes. And you set something, and you just make yourself start typing. And that's a great way of like getting past these blockages. So the idea is you just find out when it normally ends, how does it end? And that could be the beginning of a new strategy that you bring into it. Another kind of funny question you ask people is, if whatever your problem in work or life, if you were to train an actor, okay, so Sharif, if you were training, say, Kevin Bacon, I say that because you are perhaps related to Kevin Bacon. That's what I've heard. Yeah, you're related to the Bacons from Massachusetts. So if you were to train him in how to do your work problem, how would you make sure he's doing it exactly the way you do it? And not just what's happening on the screen, but what's happening in the chair, on your face, like what exactly? And what you see is that, in fact, when we have problems, implicit in that are always these elements of our attitude towards the problem, what we do with our attention in the problem, and then how we are taking steps in our actions in the problem. So it's not simply laying out the steps of the problem, which is a great way, but one of the steps we have to think of is, where do you normally put your attention when this problem comes? So in the argument, say a couple is having an argument, they might put their attention in all the ways in the past the person has done the same thing. And that's why they start using words like always or never. Okay, well then that would be an important thing to play with when this trigger happens the next time. Or what's the way of framing it? Are they dreading it happening? Or could they be reframing it, seeing it as a new opportunity to practice a new strategy? But the frame, the attention, the action, those are all part of this implicit dis-mastery that occurs.
Yeah, I was thinking of with the Kevin Bacon example, if you're explaining to an actor that you also want to explain like, well, this is what I would be aiming for. This is my intention in doing it, which is, I guess, what you're saying with the attitude and the frame that you have. So,
yes.
Well, this is great, Kevin. We've been able to tie back in reframing mindfulness and challenge into this.
Yeah,
approach.
It's always there, isn't it? So there's always some way of going back. I think when people are captivated by this dis-mastery, it's because they're usually trying to change the trigger. And the trigger is something they, in fact, don't have any control over. So they think, oh, if only, like we didn't get started. And they try to make sure that, well, no, but within any kind of relationship, there will always be triggers. With addictions, there's always a trigger. So it can't be you just try to prevent the trigger. And also another sign you're stuck is you keep asking why. Like, why does this happen to me all the time? instead of asking, how am I doing this? What exactly am I doing while I'm doing it?
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, I think we've covered a lot of
All right.
this implicit mastery. So I don't know if do you have any final thought you want to end on?
Maybe just this, that every stage of mastery has its strengths. So implicit mastery does free you up while you're doing things to not have to pay so much attention to some elements. The way to make sure you never reach a plateau is that you are always in some way stretching yourself when you're working. If you're stretching yourself in how you do it, you'll eventually have to start thinking about how do I bring a new quality to my way of doing it? And once you start thinking about qualities, you're already starting to move on to the next stage, which is optimizing. The key to optimizing is setting quality goals for how you do things. And I think that's where, in fact, then not only do you find you have more meaning, but you profoundly start to shape your own desires. So the deepest thing is the shaping of our own desires. And that is attained, I think, in that last stage of mastery, which is the optimizing stage.
Which is a good kind of preview. So we'll discuss that next week.
More next week.
That's great. Okay. Awesome. Well, Kevin, thanks so much. This was great.
Thank you, Sharif.
All right. So we'll be back next week.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.